I would like to welcome everyone once again to this month's Wildlife for Lunch webinar. Today's webinar is on agricultural conservation easements, and it's going to be presented by Ken Kearley, Stewardship Director for the Texas Agricultural Land Trust. Today's webinar is made possible through funding provided by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition Incorporated, and it's hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Ken, with that, you should have controls here shortly, and you're good to go.
Okay. Well, thank you, Clint. Glad to have this opportunity to visit with you folks about agricultural conservation easements. For those of you that don't know me, my background is in ranching, about 14 years worth, and then working for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service as well as A&M AgriLife Research for a total of 21 years. And basically my whole working life been involved in some level of land management or another. And I, like you, have noticed the big change across the countryside. A lot of formerly productive agricultural land is being covered up. And by saying in this subtitle that it's a valuable tool for conserving open space, we're talking about that land that was formerly wildlife habitat and in ag production, and is no longer open space, but is now some development into non-agricultural use. So that's concerned me, as I'm sure it has many of you. I'm tickled to be a part of Texas Ag Land Trust now because I share the concern about that. And one of the tools we can use to try to halt or at least stem the tide of the fragmentation, the breaking up of this country, and the change in land use away from open space is an agricultural conservation easement. I grew up a large part in Travis County. My family history on the Kearley side, at least from the mid-1850s, mid-1800s to today, has been in that county. And I recall on what we call the old place, what it looked like back then. Fortunately, a good part of it is still undeveloped because it was sold in the 60s to the city of Austin for a city park, and it was intended, much of it, to be left undeveloped. So I'm fortunate, even though a conservation easement didn't enter into the picture, to at least be able to go back to the home country, at least on one side of my family. And I've always had a strong connection to the land, and I'm grateful for that turn of events so that I can still go back there. And I know a lot of people share that sentiment. They may be concerned about their family legacy land-wise being threatened by current conditions. And agricultural conservation easements are something I'd like for you to think about. Not something to go into without having talked to everybody in your family at the outset and finding out what their goals are. But let me give you some insight into what we're talking about here.
Hey, Ken?
Yeah.
Can I get you to do something for me real quick? Some of the attendees seem to have a hard time hearing you. Under the Communicate tab on the top of your screen, if you open the speaker microphone audio test on the on the microphone, slide that slider all the way to the right as if the volume would be all the way up. And just remember to close that window whenever you're done with that.
Closed.
Oh, much louder. Okay.
Okay, good. Okay, I just was made aware that I needed to crank up the volume a little bit. We just did that. I hope we'll be okay now. Sorry for some of you not having heard everything that was said, but basically I was just saying that I appreciate a tool that can help a family's land legacy be preserved through a conservation easement from personal experience. Texas Ag Land Trust has as its mission to try to halt the loss and fragmentation of these lands, rural agricultural lands in Texas. We were developed as a resource for those who are interested in conservation easements. Our board is comprised of landowners who understand what it takes to run country and the day-to-day challenges of working lands. And we're an ag-friendly, landowner-friendly organization. We hold agricultural conservation easements on about 226,000 acres of privately owned country. and native wildlife habitat throughout the state. And as I mentioned, we make it a point of policy not to interfere in day-to-day management of farming and ranching. And we recognize that conservation easements aren't for everyone. It's very much a personal decision that folks come to and take some time to contemplate whether or not it might work for you. We'll talk about that in more detail here. First of all, I want to present to you some of the situation. The Texas Land Trends Study was done by and continues to be done by the Institute of Renewable Natural Resources at Texas A&M under the direction of Neil Wilkins first, now Roel Lopez. And they've done some great work looking at the trends in Texas, and it has, as you'll see, some real importance to what we're talking about today. They use data from county appraisal districts, USDA National Ag Census Service, and Ag Statistics Service, and others to figure out the relationship between land value, land ownership, land use, and so forth. And primarily we're talking about today working lands, whether it's farms, ranches, family forests, or whatever, and whether they're under ag tax valuation or wildlife tax valuation. We've all seen evidence of Texas changing, no doubt. We have 171 million acres. Of that, 142 million acres are private working lands. About 95% private land, 5% public. And a sort of a sobering realization to me is this fact that 17% of it's already developed and only 83% is left in rural land. Our population is about 26 million today. As you know, it's been growing. If you look at this graphic here, each person there represents 250,000. If you think about a proportion of them who are rural landowners being 10%, that would be that many in the case of our graphic here. And then if you just look at landowners, that's less than 1% of the population, and it would only be one of those people. It gives you an idea of just what the situation is today. And further, the population is growing, of course, about a 36% increase since 1997, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing down. That's roughly 500,000 per year, and 65% of that increase was in the top 10 populated counties, which, of course, are expanding to accommodate the people and using up more and more land as they do so. People have to live somewhere, of course. If you project those numbers, with no change, just population growth, we're still going to grow. I mean, no more people moving into the state. And just from population growth, we're still going to have over 30 million people by 2050, projected by the state demographer. If we look at only half of the migration that's happening now, half as much migration, we're still going to be over 40 million at 2050. And then if the same trend continues, we're going to be way up close to 55 million people. That point only being brought out right now to emphasize the fact that we've got to think about how we're going to protect land from development, valuable, productive agricultural and wildlife habitat land from development. If we have that desire, and I'd hope we would. I said we have 142 million acres. Well, that's down from 143 million acres in 1997 of working lands. We lost about 1 million acres over that 15-year period. The trend continues. Statewide, what's driving this? Market value, of course, makes it tempting to go ahead and sell land and make a profit and possibly buy land elsewhere, but that land ends up being developed. That open space often is lost. A gain of about $1,000 per acre accrued over that period of time statewide. And of course, we probably know examples of some country that's had a much higher increase than that locally and around some of these municipal areas. And the ability to make a living on that country, or at least come out in the black economically with your ag operation, is drastically affected by the size of ownership. There seems to be a change, a threshold, so to speak, around 140 to 179 acres, smaller than which it's very difficult to come out on top with an agricultural operation. You're constantly spending more than you're making. And that's just emphasized or exacerbated as the property gets smaller. We've seen some increase, or we we see the ability to be productive, to be profitable in this range of 1,000 to 2,000 acres, and also more than 2,000 acres, and on down to as low as 180 acres or so. It's interesting to see that the greatest amount of profit is in that size of 1,000 to 2,000 acres, just as an interesting note. Ownership size really relates to fragmentation, and by fragmentation, as the name implies, we're just talking about country being broken up into smaller and smaller pieces, making it less likely that you can make a living on it with ag production, which exacerbates the problem of going ahead and selling it for development. That's not necessarily a problem for the people that do it, that's their choice, but in the big picture, we're losing a lot of open space. We saw during that period of time of increase of about 500,000 acres of less than 100-acre farms, a decrease of 4 million acres of 100 to 2,000 acre farms, and an increase actually of greater than 2,000 acre farms, and by farms I mean farms and ranches, which is a good sign. At least some country is being consolidated. The change in open space is just dramatic, and you can see it from some of the graphics that our NR has produced. Land use conversion, especially around the major metropolitan areas, Metroplex, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, Rio Grande Valley, El Paso, and maybe in some surprising places to you as you look at this. So there's a sense of urgency we want to convey to people. We sure feel it. For every 1,000 people who move to Texas, about 200 acres of open space, rural working lands are lost to accommodate those folks. And it's not a record we really cherish, but Texas is losing rural land at a faster rate than any other state. And that loss impacts a lot of things, including our ability to produce food. That may be the first thing that comes to mind, but also water resources, for example, water quality and water abundance. So the primary threat, I would say, is fragmentation, breaking the country up into smaller and smaller pieces. And that can happen through development or just conversion away from agricultural production and provision of wildlife habitat. The estate tax has a considerable impact on fragmentation, because many families have to sell part of the place to settle an estate. And that's a common occurrence. Really works against good natural resource management. And it's basically an existential threat. Fragmentation threatens the existence of open space, and it's something we're proud as Texas Agricultural Land Trust to be able to provide a solution for, should people want to utilize it. Let's start by talking about what a conservation easement is. It's a voluntary legal agreement between a landowner and a qualified easement holder, like Texas Ag Land Trust, that permanently limits the property's uses to protect the property's conservation values. It's the operative word here is voluntary. It's enabled by state statute in the Natural Resources Code. It's important to keep in mind that it's a negotiated document. No two are exactly alike. They don't have to be anyway. It's something that you and the land trust together will agree upon, and would contain restrictions that fit your goals and allow you to conserve that country perpetually. It's you have the option of either donating or selling an easement. It's filed at the courthouse as a real estate transaction. It's a legal agreement provided under state law, as I mentioned. And it's really just a matter of a landowner exercising some of their private property rights voluntarily. You would be selectively removing certain rights from the land that fit your objectives for the future. In other words, foregoing any development of it other than agricultural use. The land can be sold or gifted. Each easement is individually tailored, as I mentioned. So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. It protects specific conservation values, and I'll flesh that out in a minute. Generally, they're perpetual. As I said, it's filed at the courthouse as a real estate transaction, so it runs with the land. It's binding on all future owners. Now, to some people, that might be something that would make you pause and think about it, and I hope it would, because it is a serious decision to make, but it's exactly the decision some people want to make. They want to permanently protect their country. And as I said, it's not for everyone, but for those who want to protect that family legacy or just the open space associated with that land, regardless of whether a quote family is involved, it can be a very good tool. Excuse me, a very good tool. Agricultural conservation easements focus on the preservation of open space, where the purpose is to protect farm and ranch land. The IRS, and you notice I mentioned the IRS code right here, the IRS, by allowing significant deductions for this type of donated easement, have determined that it's in the public interest to preserve the farm or ranch. And that's the open space we're talking about. And the conservation values that conservation easements protect, and it could equate to the purposes of the easement for a person, is protection of significant natural resources that might be water, endangered species, or their habitats, protection of historical resources, public access for recreation or education. Public access is not required. It might be what some would prefer to allow. You're entirely able to say yay or nay about that. Most of the easements that we hold do not allow public access, and yet there is one that specifically has educational purposes in mind, and does allow public access. But that can be a stumbling block for some people, because they think a conservation easement requires public access. It does not, unless you want it to. That is just one of the conservation values that the IRS has listed as one that you could choose in your conservation easement. So as I said, the purpose is to protect the viability and productivity of ag lands while protecting these conservation values. There are types of conservation easements. One is donated. I mentioned that just now, and it's governed by those IRS regulations, with the IRS having determined that there's a public benefit to preserving ag producing lands. There's the ability to qualify for a tax deduction, and it has to be a perpetual easement in order to get that. The donated easements are governed by Section 170H in the IRS code, and they're also known as qualified conservation contributions. Another type of conservation easement is a purchased easement. Some people call it a PDR, purchase of development rights. And they're governed by the rules of the organization making the purchase, depending on who that funder might be. They can be for a term of years. Most of the easements that we've dealt with so far have been permanent, but those other kinds of easements are available. And then a bargain sale is a combination of a donated and a purchased easement. Sometimes you may not have enough funds to match a purchased easement source, and you make those up on your own as a portion of it being donated. But whatever the situation might be, a combination of donated and purchased is a bargain sale, which happens sometimes. It's not unusual. So agricultural conservation easement limits the non-ag use of land while encouraging the business of farming and ranching. It's generally perpetual. Flexibility allows changes in economic conditions. You know, you wouldn't want to write up an easement that says you cannot, that your agricultural operation is limited to such and such, because in the future, economics may dictate that you change to some other operation, and you wouldn't want to limit that. The conservation easement allows for that. It permits construction of new buildings, ag buildings, fences, waterings, and residential dwellings. There'll be some determination of where the residential dwellings would need to be, and even some of the larger ag buildings. But it definitely permits those things. Those are negotiated aspects of it. It doesn't require public access. It doesn't provide immunity from condemnation. It'd be nice if it did. It could be a entity seeking eminent domain might swerve around your place just for the sake of PR because you have a conservation easement, but they're not required to do that. It won't give you immunity against that. Now, you may think right off the bat, if this is permanent, what if I change my mind, or what if my heirs change their mind, or some future owner change their mind? They don't want this conservation easement anymore. They can be terminated, but only under very rare circumstances. I wouldn't count on that being done. The people that we like to deal with, and I think you should approach this to whatever land trusts you're dealing with in the same way, have the heart for protecting that country. They're not thinking about how they could get out of it. If you are thinking about how you can get out of it, it may not be the kind of tool, probably isn't the kind of tool you'd want to use. Folks that are most committed to the conservation easement are those who are doing exactly what they want to do. They're making sure the country's protected in perpetuity. By the way, heirs can sell, they can bequeath, they can petition. That is, if that's negotiated in the easement in the future, partition the place into one or two more pieces. Again, that's part of what's negotiated in the easement. What about energy development? Oil and gas, often a consideration for people. How would that affect oil and gas production? Some people would not like it not to be on the place if they don't have minerals, but IRS allows for subsurface extraction, and if someone else owns the minerals, they could certainly come in and explore and produce if they wanted to. So that won't protect you from that. We'd sure recommend you have a good surface use agreement with them if you don't own the minerals. Surface mining, IRS doesn't allow that. In their language, I believe they say you can't materially alter the surface, and that surface mining certainly does that. And they've been silent on the issue of wind and solar energy, so most of the easements don't allow wind turbines for that reason. Now, how about negotiating a conservation easement? The process is pretty much the same for donated or purchased easements. You determine the reserved rights, how many partitions and how many buildings would be allowed, so forth. The number is negotiated by the number of partitions, that is negotiated by the easement holder and the landowner, the easement holder being Talt in this case. And typically just depends on the size of the property and the amount of development or fragmentation around it. Allowing it for at least one partition gives you some flexibility with your heirs in case one of the heirs wants to sell, another does not, for example. The term building envelope, it might be something you've heard of. Within a building envelope, which is a predetermined area within which you can build, refers is something that needs to be determined in the conservation easement, and it gives you some flexibility to build within that area without always having to get permission from the easement holder. Get an appraisal, preferably from an appraiser that knows about conservation easements. Increasingly, the IRS is starting to scrutinize appraisals, and unfortunately, some of them have been inflated and have caught their attention. So it's really important to use an appraiser with a proven track record for appraising conservation easements. And then develop a baseline report that documents conservation values. It's a document that's signed by both the easement holder and the landowner. It documents through photographs and maps and written descriptions what the reserved rights are and the current use of the property and so forth, conservation values of the property and current infrastructure, whatever the baseline condition of the property is. And then that's used in the future for monitoring as things go on. Annually, the easement holder is supposed to make a monitoring visit, and should any violations of the easement occur, they can use that the baseline document to enforce the donor's intentions. And that's an important point. If the donor's intentions are what's being protected here, nothing more, nothing less. So what about tax savings? I mentioned the deductibility, the deduction option. Conservation easement provides tax savings through an income tax deduction when they're donated. And there's a lower appraised value in the estate for both the donated and a purchased conservation easement. The incentive is some call it an enhanced tax incentive. Congress made it permanent in 2015. Provides the ability to donate 50% of your adjusted gross income each year for a total of 16 years because it carries forward 15 years and you can include the current year. And if more than 50% of your income comes from ag production, you can deduct 100% of your adjusted gross income. Now let's look at an example of how that would work. Let's say you have a Central Texas ranch of 1,750 acres. The average price per acre is determined by the Texas A&M Real Estate Center, which I would highly recommend to you, by the way, as a good source of information about current land values and trends. Said that in that area, land sells for $2,969 on average. So the market value of the place is $5,195,750. And you're thinking about putting it into a conservation easement. So the valuation process works basically the same, whether it's a donated or a purchased easement. Typically, they look at comparable sales. At least that's what real estate appraisers usually do. But the more common method for appraising a conservation easement is to look at the highest and best use and what the value is before and after the restrictions are put into place. So after the easement, we see in this example, the appraiser valued it at $3,637,000 and making the charitable contribution, the rest of the value of the place that was determined by a second appraisal, $1,558,000. So before the easement, you see the value there and how much it was decreased by, in this case, 30%. So the charitable contribution is 30% of the value of your place. Let's assume the adjusted gross income is pretty much constant through the years and it's $200,000. In that case, if they deducted 50% of it each of 16 years, they get to deduct a total of $1.6 million, which covers is a little more and is adequate to cover the entire deduction. It can be a very good outcome for a lot of people. Estate taxes or state settlement, I should say, has governed or turned out to be the top motive for selling land. I mentioned that the estate tax was counterproductive, I believe, for good land management because it keeps facilitates breaking land up into smaller and smaller pieces. One way that a conservation easement can help is by reducing the value, of course. Let's say Mr. Smith puts a conservation easement on his place and reduces the value to $9 million. These are places very much comparable in the same neck of the woods. Mr. Jones did not do anything similar, and when he passed away, the state taxes and partitioning it amongst the heirs ended up to where they lost about a third of the place, or a little more. And it was broken up into two pieces after being sold, or sold in two pieces, and then the heirs split it up into four pieces. So in one fell swoop, a formerly intact, large, we would hope profitable agricultural operation is broken up into 6 smaller pieces, making each one of them less likely to be profitable. And also, I keep mentioning the word profit. That profit is not the only motivation here by any means. As the country is broken up into more and more pieces and some of it taken out of production, you lose the ability to provide that good, clear, abundant water through healthy rangelands, filtering it before it gets to municipal areas or to reservoirs. That's one example. Wildlife habitat is diminished. Ag production is diminished, whether or not it's profitable. So there are a lot of downsides to country being broken up into smaller and smaller pieces, and that's what can happen and does happen many times as a result of the estate tax. Purchased agricultural conservation easements can be funded by the federal programs such as Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, formerly known as the Grasslands Reserve Program. Many of you may have worked with that in the past. And it was passed in the last Farm Bill, funded pretty well, up for renegotiation in the coming Farm Bill. It requires a match, though, and that match in funds has been recently met by the state Farm and Ranch Lands Conservation Program. It's managed by the Texas Park and Wildlife Department. So if you're selling a purchased easement, these federal funds and state funds together are not very abundant. State funds are $2 million. That's a lot of money in my checkbook, but it's not much when it comes to buying conservation easements. So it's very competitive and not very abundant. We're glad to have it, of course, but it's difficult to find a buyer for a purchased easement. Not impossible, but I'm quick to tell you it's difficult. And there are also local and resource-specific funds available for conservation easements. The city of San Antonio has an aquifer protection initiative to protect their drinking water. The city, which is pretty large, $360 million. The city of Austin has a $50 million open space protection bond to protect Barton Springs. Now, both of these are thinking about the value of large blocks of country that are managed well and have good rangeland health for the benefit of water quality. And conservation easements contribute to that greatly. The Department of Defense for quite a few years have entered into agreements with people around bases and to create buffers for so that their military training activities can continue without any problems with properties being heavily populated properties being right up against their fence line. So they create buffers around them through conservation easements. And that's a possibility if you're close to a military base. Deepwater Horizon Settlement Funds, you'll remember the oil spill in 2010, I believe. British Petroleum settled on that deal to mitigate the impacts of the spill, and those funds are available. Again, highly competitive, but they're there, and in fact, we're working on a couple of properties now where we're trying to see if we can qualify for Deepwater Horizon Settlement Funds. Mitigation banking is a process by which a company or entity of some kind who realizes that their activities might harm some habitat for an endangered species, for example, or some wetlands, need to buy credits to offset that. And the credits are generated by land being set aside elsewhere, protected by a conservation easement that can suffice for a substitute or a replacement for the country that they might be negatively impacting. It mitigates for their activities. So it provides them the ability to build a highway or build an industrial building or whatever in an area where it's needed that affects wetlands or affects negatively an endangered species. It enables them to go ahead and do that as long as they offset it with country elsewhere, and that's provided by this mitigation bank, which is just set aside acreage protected by a conservation easement that they can buy a piece of, basically, for that purpose. The easement holder is someone like us, like Texas Agricultural Land Trust. We're a nonprofit land trust whose benefit is, or whose mission is land conservation. It could also be a government entity. The land trust has the right to monitor and enforce the easement. We're really a partner with the landowner who places the country under a conservation easement just to help make sure the conservation values continue to be protected in the future as they wanted to when they put together the easement in the first place. We typically visit the country once a year to ensure that the terms are being upheld. There are 31 land trusts in Texas, each with a specific mission. One of the most important things to do is, when you're thinking about a conservation easement, is visit with your family or other owners, whatever the case might be, and make sure everyone's on board, make sure everyone understands, and we can come and visit with people anytime and help you get better educated about conservation easements if that's needed. We have good resources on our website. But besides deciding whether or not you want to do a conservation easement, then you have the decision to make as to which land trust you would use. Texas Agricultural Land Trust might be the one that fits you best. Some other might fit you best, but you need to make that decision. So what are the benefits and drawbacks of a conservation easement? I think it'd be fair to talk about that, wouldn't it? First, let's talk about the drawbacks. I'm sure you suspect there might be a few, and there are. Wouldn't be forthright if we didn't say there were. Transactions can be high. They generally are high, as considered by most landowners, many landowners. The expenses would include things like attorney's fees, appraisal, title opinion or insurance, that baseline report I mentioned earlier, and an endowment that can fund the proceeds from which can fund the annual monitoring visits. It takes generally 9 months or more. I wouldn't count on it being done any quicker than that. That's a transaction of time, I guess you might say. The funding is limited for purchased easements. It's not really easy to find. It can be found, but honestly, it's difficult. The sale of a conservation easement is subject to capital gains tax. It's generally only for the first generation, and that's important to know. Nothing in the easement. Pardon me, I got off track there. Tax benefits are generally only available to the first generation, including this capital gains tax. The use of the property is limited for the future. That may be exactly what you want, and it's important to remember that, though, and to realize that is the case. And of course, the value of the property is reduced by the conservation easements. You either recoup that through having sold the conservation easement or the tax deduction benefits. Now the benefits. It's a voluntary mechanism to protect the property from fragmentation or development. It's a benefit because it fits some families' long-term stewardship goals for the farm or the ranch, and it may be exactly what they want to do. It's an income tax deduction, can be. There are estate tax benefits. You've probably heard it said lately that we're looking at the greatest intergenerational transfer of property ever in the history of this country in the next few years, as baby boomers turn their country over to either through some legal means or through passing away to their heirs. And the estate tax is going to have a tremendous impact on that, and this can help you with that somewhat. It's a way to convert equity to cash if you have a purchased easement. And it just helps the farmer, rancher, you might say memorialize for future generations their love for the land. It creates a legacy for future generations. Some of the resources that are available to you are on our website, Texas Agricultural Land Trust. And the Texas A&M Land Trend Study is a powerhouse of information that I would recommend to you. I've just given you a tiny bit of what they have available in this presentation, just to whet your appetite. The Texas Land Trust Council is a statewide organization of land trusts in Texas that has a good bit of information about other land trusts you might choose if Texas Ag Land Trust isn't for you. Land Trust Alliance is a national organization of land trusts, and then the American Farmland Trust. I'd be surprised if many of you haven't already heard of that. Also a good information source. Here are addresses for me and others in leadership at our organization. Blair Fitzsimmons, the CEO, her address is there. James Oliver, Chief Operating Officer, and then my address below. Be sure and call us, contact us, email us if you have any questions. Of course, we have a good bit of time here to answer your questions if people have any. But we'd be glad to visit with you at any time.
Thank you, Ken.
Yes, sir.
We do have a couple questions that came in. We'll get to those one second. I want to remind everybody that we're encouraging people to fill out the post-event survey. If you do fill out that survey, you'll be entered into a drawing for the 2018 dove season for a hunt for two in Hondo, as well as a Yeti cooler. So please fill out that survey at the end. We still do have plenty of time, so if you have questions, feel free to jump in here with some more questions. First one, Ken, on a 15-year deduction, can you do more than one at a time?
That's a good question. I don't know. IRS isn't very logical sometimes. Logic would tell you why not, but I don't know. I'll have to find that out for you. And
Okay.
if you'll email me whoever the questioner is, I'll be glad to follow up with that. Very good question. Hopefully I can answer the next one.
Are there any yearly fees that have to be paid to the land trust?
Well, the only one I would call yearly would be the maintenance of liability insurance, which is part of the requirement of the easement. And the endowment that I mentioned is a non-wasting endowment, and the proceeds from that are intended to fund the monitoring of your place. So that insurance is the one thing that will be a recurring expense. I would guess you've already got that. Most people do, so it may not even be an additional expense.
Okay. That's all the questions we have right now. Again, we still have time. If you still want to post questions up, a couple more quick things on my end.
Well, Clint?
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
I could add 2 or 3 slides now that I see we have some time. If it'd be all right.
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
Okay. I really anticipated someone possibly asking about oil and gas production. I briefly touched on that a while ago. Keep in mind that subsurface extraction is allowed if there's minimal permanent damage to the surface, and the IRS drives those requirements. I mentioned you couldn't keep someone from coming on your place to produce if you didn't own the minerals, you didn't have any say about it. But a good surface use agreement can help in the regard that IRS requires limited and localized production. So that surface use agreement is all important in making sure that happens. If you look at this Google image right here, you can see well pads along these roads. This is a good job of someone having a good surface use agreement so that the oil production pads, and a lot of them are laterally drilled into other areas in between the pads, of course, but they're all lined up on corridors as well as the pipelines. And so it really helped cut down on overall impact on the ranch. And that's a way that it can be limited and localized. And then IRS also, and probably you as a landowner, would like to see the country restored after production. And there are some real good sources now. South Texas Natives is a source of good native seed for much more than just South Texas now. I would contact them whether you're in South Texas or not. Forrest Smith is the director of that entity out of the Cesar Clayburgh Wildlife Research Institute. And they produce foundation seed that seed retailers will have available for you, but they have some good recommendations for native seeds for all parts of the state. And depending on the part of the state, they may or may not have a large supply of seed available, but they're working toward that. And they can help you reduce the impact of those well sites by planting native grasses and restoring them. You see an example here of a real successful, probably 5-acre well pad that was reduced down to less than an acre and covered with a good cover of the diverse cover of native grasses. They can. Another thing that makes it limited and localized, if one of the conservation values in your easement is scenic value, it can be something as simple as camouflaging tank batteries or painting them a color that helps them blend in. Those are things that can make oil and gas production more palatable to the landowner, as well as help conserve the conservation values that the easement delineates. I mentioned surface mining is prohibited, and that's a Internal Revenue Code deal. And I would venture to say a lot of people, maybe most people that are looking at a conservation easement aren't thinking about putting their place into turning their place into a gravel pit anyway. But that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. And that's all I had. I just wanted to, now that I had time, I wanted to convey that information to you.
Okay. Can you expand a little bit on the endowment requirement?
Yes, I can't put an exact figure on it. I'd be afraid to do that just because I might miss the mark big time. But think about the amount of money that would need to be set aside so that the proceeds would pay my way as stewardship director or whoever succeeds me to come once a year. And we're real frugal with this money. For instance, when we're doing these monitoring easements, we might do three a day, you know, and travel to one part of the state. I live in Amarillo, but work the whole state. I'll pick out the Trans-Pecos, for example, and work in that area over a period of 2 or 3 days to cover everything. So it reduces costs significantly. I mention that because it has an impact on how big these endowments need to be. It is something that the landowner needs to provide, though, because we're a nonprofit. We don't have the funds to do this on our own. Our mission is to help people conserve their land, and we have to be funded through grants and other means. But individually, the easement landowner who has an easement would be required to provide the funds for that stewardship endowment. Think about how big it would be so that the proceeds would allow for me to get that work done, and that might give you some idea with today's low interest rates. And feel free to call and talk to us about your individual situation. We can probably give you a closer estimation, or some attempt at it anyway.
All right. Real quick, I will post up, or I just posted up in the chat window, a link if you want to go back and watch this webinar again. You can watch this and any of our other webinars at the link provided there. And I would also like to point out that June 15th is our next webinar, third Thursday of June. It's going to cover using federal farm bill programs to improve wildlife habitat. Be presented by Chuck Koleski with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Getting back over to the webinar screen, I don't see any more questions, so Ken, it looks like they're going to let you off easy.
I think I saw one pop up there about
something.
Well, it just popped up and then disappeared. And I think it had to do with whether or not a piece of property that was formerly gravel pit or something like that, a caliche pit, would be eligible for a conservation easement.
Okay, I see it now. If surface mining has occurred in the past, would that disqualify the property?
You know, I don't really know. If it was a lignite mine and they recovered it, you know, they do a fair job of, maybe a really good job in some cases, of restoring country to grassland, although the elevation's lower, of course, because they've removed so much below it. I wouldn't think that would preclude it after the fact, because you still have some open space to conserve. It's been altered from what it was originally, but I think it'd be something to talk about. It sure might work. It just depends on the condition it's in right now, whether there are conservation values that are currently there that can be protected. If it's still an open mine, then I'd say no, probably not, because it'd be hard to figure out what wildlife habitat, significant wildlife habitat, would be generated by that, or scenic value, for example, or historic value, thinking of those broad categories that the IRS has determined. So we'd like to talk to you about it if you have a place in mind, and just see whether it would qualify.
All right. I'm going to take the presentation controls. I'll put back up the contact information here for y'all. Leave that up for just a second. If you want to reach out to them, this page here. So if you want to reach out to Ken for some more questions, or anybody else, here's their contact information once again. So be sure to jot that down before you sign off. With that, Ken, I think that's all we have. I really appreciate the presentation. Excellent as always.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, sir. We'll talk to you soon.
All right.